feel bad about white kids having hear about their white privilege was enough to propel anti-critical race theory candidate Glenn Youngkin to victory in the most recent Virginia governor's race. Tonight, we will explore the real story of critical race theory with our distinguished panelists of legal scholars and professors who would certainly fall into the category of critical race theory experts. So with that, we will get this program started and we will turn it over to Judge Angela Robinson for our first presentation.
Thank you so much for handing it over to me. And I want to thank the Epsilon Iota chapter of Omega Psi Phi for inviting me to share in this exciting conversation. I am going to share my screen with you as we get started, because I did prepare a PowerPoint slide. So let me just introduce myself to you. I feel like I don't need to, because I see so many names that I remember and know, and I feel like I'm coming to a homecoming. But I am Angela Robinson, and at this moment, the reason I think I'm here is I teach critical race theory at Quinnipiac Law School. And I've been teaching it for a number of years. I've been so lucky to have Attorney Jefferson come every time I teach it and be a guest lecturer. And it's something that I've come to love and admire, although I hesitate to call myself a critical race theory expert. So today, what I want to do is just give you a brief overview of critical race theory, how it came to be, and some of the context for how it got started in law schools. Before I do that, I have to say all of the opinions expressed in this are my own, and they are not those of Quinnipiac Law School. Every time I talk about critical race theory, I always start with a land acknowledgement. And I start with a land acknowledgement because it's really important when we're talking about race to understand how that legal concept has affected not only Black Americans, but also Native Americans. And I teach at an institution that is named after a Native American tribe, the Quinnipiac tribe. So I think it's appropriate for me always to acknowledge the indigenous people and tribes upon whose land most of us reside, particularly the Quinnipiac tribe, for whom Quinnipiac University is named. For thousands of years, they stewarded the lands and waterways, and we need to acknowledge and respect and honor the people and the relationship they had with this land. I say all of this understanding that a land acknowledgement is not enough. It is just an acknowledgement and a start. So today my goals for today are trifold. I would like to sort of debunk some misconceptions and myths, although I'm going to defer largely to Professor Wharton to do that, because I know he's going to cover a lot of it. I'm going to provide a brief historical explanation, and I'm going to share some resources that might be available. Brother Wharton already mentioned the fact that Governor Youngkin campaigned and won largely by attacking critical race theory. And in fact, his first official act as governor of Virginia was to sign an executive order against critical race theory. Within a 4-month period in 2021, Fox News mentioned critical race theory 13,000 times. And by the end of 2021, 9 states had passed anti-critical race theory bills, although not all of them used the words critical race theory. And many state and local board of educations have mounted campaigns against what they call critical race theory, and even started banning books. So obviously, critical race theory is a hot topic. It's obviously something that has been very animating, but most people don't know what it is or how it came to be. So to start, I want to say, first off, it is not taught in primary or secondary schools. You're not going to find critical race theory in elementary, middle, or high school. In fact, People who are against critical race theory have counted how many colleges offer classes in critical race theory. And by their count, the number is no more than about 300. So the people who don't like critical race theory have to acknowledge that no more than about 300 colleges even offer classes in critical race theory. And that's out of 4,000 colleges and universities in the country. So what's really going to happen is you're going to find critical race theory when you get to the graduate school level most often. Critical race theory is not Marxism. There are some reasons I think that has gotten twisted, and if we have time, I can talk to you about that, but it is absolutely not Marxism. It's not anti-white, it's anti-racist. So critical race theory is about removing racism for everyone. It is not aligned with one political party or the other. In fact, critical race theory scholars are often as or more critical of liberal politicians and progressives as they are of conservatives. And most importantly, critical race theory is not new. It's been around for decades. So what is it then? I call it a big tent. It's a big academic tent. And the scholars and the theorists who are under that tent don't all agree with each other. There are very vigorous debates within critical race theory about the right approaches, the right remedies, even the right methodologies. You know, whether we should focus more on storytelling or whether we should focus more on social science studies. But there are a few things that all critical race theory scholars agree on. And I call these the three central tenets. People will tell you different things. There's some people who say there are 5 central tenets. There's some people who say there's 6. I think all of them can be condensed into these 3 tenets. And every scholar that I have read who advocates critical race theory, teaches it, believes in all of these 3 things. The first is that race is a social construct. Race is not biologically based. It is completely man-made. And in this case, men, I am meaning that literally. It was made by men. 2, racism is pervasive. So under the model of critical race theory, racism is more than individual acts and individual animus against individual people. It's a problem that exists beyond a few bad apples. This is the one that gets the most public attention because people say, oh, are you saying that all white people are racist? And again, I won't have time to get very far into explaining, no, that is not what is being said when we use the term racism is pervasive. And then finally, all critical race theory scholars believe that we cannot use a colorblind approach to remedy racism. Colorblind approaches only maintain the status quo. We have to use race-conscious remedies and color-conscious remedies. So to understand critical race theory and how it came to be, we have to dig a little bit deeper into the first tenet. And that first tenet is that race is socially constructed. Thankfully, we now know, after 500 years of scientific exploration on this topic, we now know that humans are 99.9% genetically the same, genetically identical. The Human Genome Project confirmed this in the early 2000s. And so we know that we all on this call are 99.9% identical genetically. So of course, what happened when that study came out was there were a bunch of people who said, okay, that 0.1%, that must be race. And we know that not to be true. So we're 99.9% genetically the same. And that 0.1% difference, the variations among humans, does not correlate to race. So there's actually more diversity among people who are in the same race than between people who are in different races. And so what this means is There is no genetic biological basis for racial differences. But that does not mean that we can't quantify racial differences, right? So we're genetically, biologically the same, but we know that there are disparities that we can document and track over time based on race. And I know most of you know this, so I'm going to go really quickly through this. We know that the average net wealth of the average white family is at least 10 times more than that of the average Black family. And we know at the pace that we're going, it will take 228 years to narrow that gap. We know that homeownership rates are higher among whites than among any other racial group. We know that there is a persistent income gap that we can track by race. And there's this great study of medical doctors, which shows that on average, white medical doctors with the exact same education and the exact same expertise and the exact same specialty make $40,000 more than their Black counterparts and $15,000 more than their Asian American counterparts. We know that segregation is still a problem. We know that we all still live predominantly in neighborhoods that would be considered segregated, and that we're educated in schools that meet the definition of legal segregation. And we know that Black and brown people are overrepresented in the criminal justice system and underrepresented in leadership. So for instance, we know that about 40%, I'm going to skip the criminal justice part. We know that of the Fortune 500 CEOs that have run Fortune 500 companies over our entire history, only 19 out of 1,800 have been Black. But if we look at Black men's representation in incarceration, we can see that about 56% of the prison population is Black and brown men. So when we look and we see there's no biological difference between our races, but there are all these differences in the experience of life, why is that? And critical race theory provides some answers. Critical race theory says, by examining the role of race in our society, by using an interdisciplinary approach, by listening to previously excluded voices, we can begin to understand and unravel the mystery of racism. And so in 1989, at a workshop in Madison, Wisconsin, legal academics got together to create what is now known as critical race theory. And Kimberly Crenshaw coined that term in order to develop a coherent account of race and the law. And so critical race theory, as you've already heard, started in law schools with law professors and legal academics. And it started in the 1980s. Its original founders wanted to challenge the notion that law is neutral and that legal doctrine is neutrally applied. And so they hypothesized, these new founders, that many of the problems of inequity and imbalance in our country are related to racial inequity. And they tried to find a way to elevate the discussion of race in order to remove and dismantle racial hierarchy. And this is really an important point, because the goal of critical race theorists is not to rearrange the racial hierarchy. So it's not to take brown people and put them up above white people, or to put Asian people above white people. The goal is to dismantle racial hierarchy entirely. And so drawing upon works of other legal scholars, they came up with a framework and a perspective. And they looked at legal scholars who called themselves critical legal studies professors. They were the original crits. And they looked at legal scholars who considered themselves radical feminists. And they saw that one way to address inequity in the law was to look at hierarchy and power dynamics. The original critics, the critical legal studies scholars, believed that law was a tool of the rich and the wealthy. And among them, there were actually many avowed Marxists who believed that we needed to rearrange our economic system. And of course, as you know, the radical feminists believed that there was a hierarchy, but that it was based on gender. And so critical race theory scholars learned from these two movements that there is a way to study and address inequity by looking at hierarchy and power dynamics, but they felt that the other groups were missing a really key ingredient, and that was the role of race. And so drawing on these different movements and then building upon the scholarship of Derek Bell, who is often considered the dean of critical race theory, they came up with a framework of academic inquiry so that they could talk about race in a different way and come up with some different approaches to address racism. So I am often asked, how would I define critical race theory for a lay audience, or how would I simplify a definition so you could just say to someone what it is? And I have come up with a perspective that critical race theory is a way of looking at the problem of race. It's a way of examining it in order to try to dismantle racial hierarchy. And it has now taken off. It has left the law and gone to all different disciplines. You now find critical race theory being taught in biology, medicine, communication, math, history, political science, almost any area that you can think of. And it's also gone beyond the United States. It's now taught and studied in every continent in the world. And so what is exciting about critical race theory and why I think it has legs beyond academia is it is a way to elevate the conversation so that we can begin to craft new memories, new tools. I don't know how many of you remember the saying of Audre Lorde that the master's house will never be dismantled using the master's tools. And so what critical race theory has done is come up with some new tools, some new vocabulary, and some new approaches. So they say, for instance, we should consider storytelling and narrative as a powerful tool. It should be as powerful as the social scientific studies. Critical race theory also came up with a way to document things like implicit bias and stereotype threat. They came up with the term intersectionality and anti-essentialism, which means that we all have multiple identities. And because we are a certain identity does not mean that we're all the same. And so all of these new tools and new approaches are things that have been brought to bear and have taken off in the effort to try to dismantle and undo racism. So my takeaways for today, and what I hope will launch us into a really rich and interesting discussion, are that critical race theory is not new. It's been around for at least 3 decades, and its foundations go back even further than that. I don't have time because we're going to try to get to some other things to talk about the foundational roots that go as far back to the civil rights movement, social justice movements, the ethnic studies department movement, but all of this has been around for a long time. And so I jokingly say, if critical race theory was going to break America, we would know it by now. The other takeaway is critical race theory is just a continuation of social justice efforts that have gone on in the past in a slightly differently focused way. Critical race theory is activist based. It's never been meant to be restricted to the ivory tower. The scholars, when they founded it in 1989, wanted it to be something that would really change and improve people's lives and not just be a great subject for law review articles. Critical race theory is a discipline that you're going to generally encounter at graduate school. This is not something that's going to be taught very often at college. And it's definitely never taught in primary or secondary schools. And finally, critical race theory pursues racial equity for everyone. So it is an anti-racist movement, not an anti-white movement, not an anti-American movement. It is very much trying to restore equity, not perpetuate hierarchy. So I hope that this is a beginning for you all, not an end. I called it a journey to understanding critical race theory because obviously I am still on that journey, and I certainly didn't take you very far in the 10 to 15 minutes that I had today. But let's continue the journey. Please visit my website, Robinson Diversity Consulting, where I have some more resources, and please email me if you'd like to continue our conversation. So with that, I'm going to turn it back over to our moderator, and I'm looking forward to hearing the next presenters and questions and answers.
Oh, okay, great. Thank you for that information, Judge Robinson. And I do too look forward to the questions and the conversation. So, and just for our audience who tuned in a little late, just know we're going to have 2 more presentations. And then at the end of the presentations, we will open it up for questions. So please utilize the chat feature to put your questions in, or if you have any statements, and we will have the opportunity to do that at the conclusion of the presentations. So next up, we have Professor Jonathan Wharton, who will do his presentation. So we turn it over to you, Professor Wharton.
Thank you very much. And thank you all for including me on this panel. And I certainly appreciate everything the fraternity has done. I'm certainly very familiar with you all because I went to Howard University. So I am very grateful for all the work that you do, not just in New Haven, but beyond. So thank you for including me on this terrific discussion. Judge Robinson, bravo, very good job, especially in terms of understanding the history and the dynamics of the origins of why this theory came to be. I guess what I will add is this. I teach at Southern Connecticut State University. I specialize in state and local government as well as public policy. And, I have actually taught critical race theory for years, just like Judge Robinson. In fact, before I even came to New Haven, I taught it at a place called Stevens Institute of Technology in Hoboken, New Jersey. And it'd probably be the last place where a topic like this would ever be taught because it's an engineering institution. But I started it off because I actually look into and examine local and urban problems. And I found that this theory, among others, could be helpful in explaining some of the advantages and disadvantages that many people face economically, politically, and socially. And so I want to kind of begin off with saying that this is merely one approach among many in explaining at least social and even legal phenomena, because I think there's a misconception that critical race theory is taught as a standalone thing. It's really one of these dynamics where there's so many different theories out there and approaches that this is merely one. And I tend to, and I'm just like Judge Robinson, I am not a specialist in critical race theory. I teach it, but I'm not one where, this is my sole thing I'm teaching in one class. What I'm actually more of a specialist in is actually in an area that's similar to it, and that's actually coalition building politics. And that's a little different, and I'll get to that a little bit towards the end of this, and maybe even kind of find a way of including that. So, as I've said, I've taught at Southern for the last 8 years. I was at Stevens for 12 years. I probably have taught this class close to, or at least topics related to this, probably close to 15 years. My dissertation and my first book actually discuss a little bit on critical race theory, but I spent more time on coalition building politics. And that had to deal with the efforts and the politics surrounding Cory Booker, who was a former mayor and of course the current US Senator from New Jersey. So I was intrigued by this theory as an approach to understand kind of his lens, but also his perspective and even voters' perspectives of race in a place like Newark, and how politics and even laws can be politicized. And so I found that, critical race theory, and certainly something like coalition building politics, which I'll define in a minute, was helpful because it at least gave a vehicle, a tool to explain a couple of ways in terms of understanding how voters, constituents, politicians, candidates will see race and understand some of the problems that persist in so many areas, particularly in our cities. So with that, let me at least give at least maybe a general definition to add to exactly what Judge Robinson offered. First off, as she had mentioned, it was developed in the 70s and into the 80s, certainly, where it's an approach to consider why and how American laws have been devoid or even divisive of race. And that can be through institutional and even systemic means. So as she had offered, the thought is that race should be neutralized. So there's, it should not be race-based, but oftentimes how it's applied is really an important consideration. And so, the study of law is really inclusive in many ways because it's involving purely legislators, certainly defined in many ways by judges and executive officials, but it's also a matter how these laws have oftentimes overlooked race or how it's discriminated against Americans because of race. And by the way, I don't want to just say it's just race, because as Judge Robinson said, there are all these different layers, because intersectionality really reminds you that, it's not just a black, white, as they love to say the term, binary dynamic, right? Because we have many Americans, obviously, who are multiracial. And obviously, there's got to be a special consideration, too, in terms of ethnicities. We can't exclude gender. We can't exclude sexuality. We can't exclude class. There are all these different levels and variations that really get very sorted. And so this is kind of interesting because I teach this at Southern. I should say I teach this specifically for identity politics classes, but I've also taught it at Stevens for identity politics classes there. And I only teach one class using this. And sometimes I bring a little critical race theory into my urban politics class. But I really, as Judge Robinson says, I teach it at an upper level class and for graduate school students. This is very difficult to explain to undergraduate freshmen. So I can't even imagine how a teacher in K through 12 could ever get into this, because it requires, and it really does, you have to have an understanding of what US history is. And in order to get to that level, you have to have the basics to get into the nuances and the complexities of all these things. Because how can you really investigate something as nuanced as race without discovering and explaining away all the history that comes with it? So I hope that at least in explaining some of this in terms of the laws and its applications, its use and misuse, but also the origins of why these laws came to be, it's so critical. And history is a big aspect to this. For my own research, I examine a lot of this as it relates to housing and economic development, because that's my primary research area at the end of the day. I've always been fascinated how laws have been used and misused in many ways as it relates to housing and even economic and commercial development. And we see this in so many places, in so many ways, in so many American cities. And so sometimes zoning laws and planning laws and economic development approaches and tax abatements and, all these different ways in which you're trying to explain what is going on in communities. Critical race theory can help explain that. Along with, as I stress in my class, having a basic understanding of just American history, in addition to just some of the problems that we see in the legal system and in government. So there are various academics, as Judge Robinson offers, and legal scholars that have considered certainly how court decisions have been rendered, how laws have been applied, and even misapplied. And so critical race theories will stress that there are all kinds of pathways to further explain some of these race politics. And as Judge Robinson offered, there's not one way of doing it. I think that's the fascinating thing about critical race theorists. They will use storytelling, counter storytelling, which is very popular, maybe narratives that are biographical. And quite frankly, there are a lot of unconventional techniques and approaches which they use. So it's not uniform. It's not like there's one way of doing it, right? And the fascinating thing is that there's this misconception that it's all just in law. In fact, many of them tend to be, yes, social scientists, but it's not unusual that you get people who are in English and literature who actually adapt some of this. And heck, even every once in a while, you hear about poetry and renderings that take place there too. So that's kind of the universal approach which you see many critical race theorists will take it. But ultimately, I don't want to ignore that this kind of started out, as Judge Robinson said, from legal scholars. And a number of authors have used this in a number of classes, certainly from law school to graduate classes. As I said, my upper level classes, they provide poetry, they do articles, they do books, they do studies, they do investigations. And so for me, at least, I find that, and this is kind of difficult to grasp, I have to sometimes start from the beginning, because there's an assumption, which is a dangerous one, that students in undergraduate, even at the upper level, and interestingly enough, I see this in graduate school, have an understanding of American history as it relates to race and ethnicity. and culture and sexual orientation, all the revelation, all the movements that come with it. And so oftentimes they're lacking that. And that scares me. And it's not so much as a political scientist, but more history major, because I majored in that undergrad, thank God. I'm grateful for that at Howard. And I also have a master's degree in it. So I have an assumption that many students have an understanding of, let's just get to the basics, right? Something as simple as Reconstruction. That allows us to have that understanding of something like Booker T. Washington and W.B. Du Bois and Marcus Garvey. They don't. It's scary. Some of them have heard, they know, but they don't. So what I have to do is start from the very basics before I even get into the critical race theory, because that's when it gets very difficult. So I tend to go from there. I get a little bit into the civil rights movement, obviously, because you don't want to ignore some of those key court cases, including Brown versus Board. And then I really spend more time on some of the housing problems and some of the discrimination that we've seen in a number of different laws and practices, especially as it relates to the term that's oftentimes used as de facto segregation, where you see invisible housing segregation taking place. There's a misconception, and God knows I tried my best to debunk it in my classes, but that when it comes to segregation, it's purely a Southern phenomenon. But I had to point out all the examples of how the North, especially, and God, you should see the pearls of clutch in my class, particularly in New England. The last thing the students ever want to get into or ever have an understanding is to think that New England can be, racist in many of its practices as it relates to housing discrimination. And I have to go through all these court cases, all these examples, all these policies, and then it's amazing how many students are suddenly awakened and in tune with that as a result of it. And twistedly, your assumption is that these are mostly white students. No, it's sometimes students, many times students of color, because it's a matter of how they've been taught coming from undergraduate, some of the basic level classes from even high school. So sometimes it's a matter of kind of finding a pathway of explaining a new approach, a new way of doing it. So one of my favorite books that I'll mention that I use is actually a book called Uneven Roads. And I think it's a great primer to understanding movements and even lawsuits and court cases, but also some of the social and political and economic dynamics that come with race and ethnicity. Even if it's not connected directly to critical race theory, there are many parallels. So Uneven Roads is the name of the book. It's just an introduction to US and racial and ethnic politics. It's actually written by a couple people who do critical race theory. In fact, Diane Penderhughes is one of the legendary giants in the field, among others authors. Tud Shaw is also one of them. But we go through chapter by chapter of Native Americans, of Black Americans, of Latino Americans, go down the list, and certainly gay and women. But the interesting twist is that a lot of students are kind of intrigued by the chapter on Asian Americans, because for many of my students, they made it last semester, they weren't familiar with the history of discrimination that many Asians and Asian Americans faced at the end of the 1900s, as it relates, especially in California. And so we go through state laws. It's interesting. In the back of your head, you're probably thinking, I'm only looking at federal laws. Remember what I said at the beginning, I teach state and local government. So we go through all these state laws and the practices. And I certainly mentioned, Higginbotham's book as well. That's very important. That stresses a lot about, even in New England, a lot of the racial discrimination practices, interestingly enough, in the 16 and 1700s. Again, a lot of my students are just not familiar with it. They're in shock that New Englanders would just discriminate legally. And how do I say this nicely? It scares me, because it's a matter of, I have a lot on my plate to cover, and I'm trying to get into, just in terms of the current day, let alone the historical and the political. So once I kind of at least get a bit of that, then I finally get into, and Judge Robinson, I hope you can appreciate what I'm trying to do historically. I'm trying my best to just unpack all that first, because I don't get really into the legal court cases and all the stuff that you're familiar with as critical race theory, because I'm trying to cover the political and historical. And then finally, by midterm, I get into a reader that's very popular, and she mentioned a couple well-known authors who featured in it. Derek Bell, of course, who, as she says, is really the dean of all this, and Richard Delgado. But they have an awesome book called Critical Race Theory: The Cutting Edge. So it's a very well-known book. Don't get the smaller reader, because many of my students make the mistake of getting a small one, which is more of a compact one. Get the big giant one, and don't be intimidated by it. My students get all frightened by the 1,000-page book and all the footnotes that come with it. But I will remind them that, look, they get into all of this. They even have chapters, as even Uneven Roads does, on what they call critical white studies. There's actually an entire area. I've got a white student who, believe it or not, he is a veteran. He's in his 70s and he's coming back to do his master's degree because he's interested in critical race theories. And he's actually using chapters out of this book. And he's white American. He's getting right into it. And he's fascinated by it, partly because of critical race theory, that book, The Cutting Edge. And he's using a lot of uneven roads because there are a lot of books, believe it or not, that actually investigate how American whites became white. There's a misconception that when we're talking about white Americans, we're purely talking about anybody who's white. No. For a long, long time, both books will stress it's not going to be until after World War II, because it's a matter of how the court defined it, government, and all the census and tallying that takes place by the government itself. In fact, for a long time, for generations, there was a lot of practices taking place based on whiteness that relied more on religion, ethnicity, and culture, and not just race. So I have to find a way of breaking that down in terms of recognizing, and this is kind of interesting because a lot of my students, again, aren't familiar with the laws that banned even Catholics from owning homes in various places, and even American Jews. It's just, not even American, just in general, Jewish people. So again, that requires a lot of rethinking, re-educating. So I would highly recommend that book, Critical Race Theory, if you're interested in this, because I think that could be helpful. So what I will say, and I'll kind of wrap this up, is one way of thinking about critical race theory is that it's one vehicle of understanding race in America. And it's not the only methodology. I will say to my students so often, look, if you're a real student, if you're a Renaissance person, individual, you respect that it's not just Adam Smith, right? It's not just Karl Marx, right? It is them and everything in between. It's not just black and white. It is charcoal, heather, and gray, as I oftentimes stress to my students. So it's good to have an understanding of these theories and approaches. And so, yes, as we've seen in modern times, certainly in the last year, unfortunately, it's come to be misunderstood and politicized by the media and pundits, and certainly by parents, which is unfortunate. This assumption that is somehow being taught in K through 12, but in truth, it's being taught more in higher level education places, and that's not taught everywhere. And as I said, I am one who is more understanding, respectful of coalition building politics. I find it useful and interesting to explain how cities have found pathways to address the problems of communities by seeing the communities that can find them to find pathways of working together between Latinos, Blacks, whites, and seeing that they want to resolve a community problem together. That's what I tend to study, and that's the approaches I use. Marshall, Brown, and Tabb did an awesome study, and they're kind of the fathers for coalition building politics that really investigated the examples of California when they were trying to address police and education issues, and we saw communities coming together in California. So that's what I did for my study in Newark. I looked at that and used some of those models. So I find the coalition building politics is quite fascinating. I also bring in, as I said, a little critical race theory on purpose. But I think the problem is that it tends to be misunderstood because it is very high level learning, and how you have to have an understanding just of the basic dynamics of it. So it gets misused because it's not fully defined. It's not actually explained and understanding the nuances when it comes to race, ethnicities, and the labels that come with it, and how laws can be misused and misconstrued. And unfortunately, people don't have sometimes just the basic understanding, the basic tenets of US history to go along with this. And so too often we see people politicizing it and misusing it. But I would hope that maybe this could be helpful in explaining some of this, which I attempted to do myself. I'm kind of shortenizing a lot of what I try to cover in a class. So I hope that that's helpful for you all. So thank you for this opportunity.
All right, thank you, Professor Wharton. And then last, so again, just so the audience, I already typed in the chat, please drop your questions in the chat or any comments that you might have about what you've heard so far and what you will hear coming up. And then at the end of this last presentation, we'll have the opportunity to get to your questions and have some discussion with our panelists. And regardless of what they say, we still consider them to be experts in this field, so thank you. So last and certainly not least is Michael A. Jefferson, Esquire, founder of the Kiyama movement. And he is going to bring us home in terms of his presentation this evening. So we'll turn it over to you, Brother Jefferson.
Thank you, Brother Wharton, and thank you, Brother Ross Lee, for extending the invitation. Thank the brothers of my chapter, Epsilon, Iota, and it's good to see the brothers from throughout New Haven, throughout the district on the presentation. Appreciate everyone for being here and taking the time out on this beautiful, warm winter day. I'm sure everyone had some other things they could be doing, but so thank you. Being that time is of the essence, I want to skip any remaining formalities and get to my presentation. I have asked Brother Babajide Davis to assist me in this effort. So let us begin. Next slide. So according to an Education Week analysis, since January 2021, 37 states, 37, have introduced bills or taken other steps that would restrict teaching critical race theory or limit how teachers can discuss racism and sexism. 14 states have imposed these bans and restrictions either through legislation or other avenues. And I strongly recommend folks visit Education Week. The reference is below. Next slide. Let's talk about the states. Mostly red states. And quite honestly, I don't know if Georgia, New Hampshire, Virginia is red or blue. This is just based on the last presidential election. I guess Georgia was blue. New Hampshire went blue, but they all have Republican governors. And these are the states that have outright banned critical race theory. And that's what I'm here to talk about tonight. My mission was to discuss some of the laws that have been enacted by the various states throughout the country. And so I want to spend a little time on that and then go off on a couple of other tangents here. Next slide. So let's talk about some specific laws that have been introduced. In New Hampshire, it included language banning teachers from discussing race, gender, and other identity characteristics in certain ways in class. I can't explain that. Maybe somebody out there smarter than me can. Characteristics in certain ways in class. These are how they are structuring these laws in such a general way, and we'll discuss what's driving the fear and driving the enactment of these laws. Next slide. So New Hampshire is just one. North Dakota, they actually put it right out there, bans instruction in critical race theory defined in the legislation. And I like this definition, by the way. The theory that racism is not merely the product of individual bias or prejudice, but that racism is systematically embedded in American society and the American legal system to facilitate racial inequality. That, my friends, is, for me, critical race theory. And they basically said, we're going to do away with that. Another Republican governor. Next slide. And I'm not trying to politicize it. That's already happened. It is what it is. So let's call it for what it is, right? So now, and the esteemed professor, Judge Robinson, already talked about Glenn Youngkin on his first day of his term. He issued an executive order banning, and I quote, divisive concepts, including critical race theories in schools. I mean, that's what he ran on, and that's the first thing he did. So he basically politicized the entire issue. Next slide. Oh, we're gonna save the best for last. Here's Florida. This guy is dangerous. I want to warn everyone. He's very, very dangerous, Governor Ron DeSantis, and he got a little creative when he created his law, Stop Wrongs Against Our Kids and Employees Act, or the Stop Woke Act. That's what he called it, just putting it right in our face. And that's what Florida did with critical race theory. Next slide. So, critical race theory defined. CRT does not attribute racism to white people as individuals, as been stated by Professor Wharton, Professor Robinson, or even to entire groups of people. Simply put, critical race theory states that U.S. social institutions, i.e. the criminal justice system, education system, labor system, housing market, and healthcare system are laced with racism embedded in laws, regulations, rules, and procedures that lead to differential outcomes by race. I couldn't agree more with the definition by Rayshawn Ray and Alexandra Gibbons. That's their definition. And let's talk about some of these social institutions and highlight what some of these laws have done. Next slide. Let's talk about housing segregation. So in a writer named Terry Gross talked about Richard Rothstein's groundbreaking book, The Color of Law, powerful book. Look, I've read hundreds of books in my life. I mean, hundreds. And I got to tell you, this is top 5 right here. If you need a good book to read on racism and the law, The Color of Law by Richard Rothstein, outstanding book. It examines the local, state, and federal housing policy that mandated segregation. And he notes that Federal Housing Administration, which was established in 1934, furthered the segregation efforts by refusing to insure mortgages in and near African-American neighborhood, a policy known as redlining, which, by the way, continues to this day. And get this, at the same time, the FHA was subsidizing, listen to this, subsidizing builders who were mass producing entire subdivisions for whites with the requirement that none of the homes be sold to African Americans. But this is not something they want taught at the college level, at the graduate level, at any level, if you ask me, in American education. And that's what those laws are about. That's just one example. Let's go to another institution, the criminal justice institution. We're all familiar with this institution. So according to Fair Fight Initiative in recent history, the rapid increase in incarceration started with the tough on crime, law and order, war on drugs policies initiated by President Nixon, established by President Reagan. President Bush and Clinton continued those policies and exacerbated them with Clinton's 1994 crime bill, and you know who was the architect of that. He's the sitting president of the United States right now, and that's Biden. Said he created a law for the death penalty and bragged about it. He said everything except jaywalking, he said, on the Senate floor. These are the laws that have been built into this nation's history that have undermined progress and the lives of African-American people. And Michelle Alexander's The New Jim Crow, Mass Incarceration, another phenomenal book, top 10 book. If you haven't read it, you have to read it. The New Jim Crow, Mass Incarceration in the Age of Color Blindness. And she lays it out. And this is what they don't want to teach. And this is what critical race theory is about. How the laws are laced with racism and how they create these outcomes that are unequal and, quite frankly, unjust. Next slide. Labor laws. So Senate Dixiecrats back in the day, you know, those are the guys in the South who they're Republicans now, but they called them Dixiecrats. They were Democrats back then. Conditioned their votes on the exclusion of household workers and field hands, so wealthy Southerners could continue to benefit from these Black workers' cheap labor. Caroline Frederickson did the research on this. So they withheld their votes, and they said, "Okay, we'll vote, but we don't want these folks to benefit. We don't want them to be able to join a union. We don't want them to be able to earn minimum wages and overtime after 40 hours of work in a week. So if you give us what we want, which means exclude them from the legislation, we'll give you our vote." The Social Security Act also directly excluded farm workers and domestic servants from old age benefits and unemployment insurance, clearly targeting the African Americans who filled these jobs. Southern whites were thus able to use New Deal programs to build their prejudices into the law. This is what critical race theory discusses. This is what it's about. And today in Silicon Valley, much of the color workforce is employed in minimum wage or contractor positions, and the same companies have fought tooth and nail against remedying the omissions of these workers from core employment protections. Next slide. So let's talk about some of the myths about critical race theory. Now I'll focus on a couple of them because I think they're worthy of discussion. Not that the other ones aren't, but I just want to focus on a couple of them. So the first myth, and these myths were provided by a gentleman by the name of James Lindsay, some writer or cultural critic of sorts. But he says, and this is what's out there, folks, believes racism is present in every aspect of life, every relationship, and every interaction, and therefore has its advocates look for it everywhere. Nonsense. Number two, relies upon interest conversion. White people only give Black people opportunities and freedoms when it is also in their own interest, and therefore doesn't trust any attempt to make racism better. I'm going to focus on that one. Give me 1 second. Number three, critical race theory is against free societies and want to dismantle them and replace them with something its advocates control. Absolute nonsense. And number four, only treats race issues as socially constructed groups. So there are no individuals in critical race theory. These are all myths. Next slide. Let's talk about that interest conversion. So here's the myth. CRT relies upon interest conversion. White people only give Black people opportunities and freedoms when it is also in their own interest, and therefore doesn't trust any attempt to make racism better. So that's the myth. Before I talk about it, I want to give you a quote from someone who I admired for a long time, the late great first Black tenure law professor at Harvard, Derek Bell, and as some have already mentioned, architect, founder of critical race theory. This is what he wrote, page 12, faces the bottom of the well, top 20 book, great read, one of my favorite quotes. He says, Black people will never gain full equality in this country. Even those Herculean efforts we hail as successful will produce no more than temporary, quote, peaks of progress, short-lived victories that slide into irrelevance as racial patterns adapt in ways that maintain white dominance. As racial patterns adapt in ways that maintain white dominance. That's critical. This is a hard to accept fact that all history verifies. We must acknowledge it not as a sign of submission, but as an act of ultimate defiance. So when Lindsay talks about interest conversion and says white people only give Black people opportunities and freedoms when it is also in their own interest, and therefore doesn't trust any attempts to make racism better. No, see, the thing is, I don't trust certain segments of the dominant culture to make racism better because of what Bell is saying here. The idea is to maintain white dominance. This is critical that we understand this. That's why you can't put them in charge of trying to make racism better. There's certain segments in the dominant culture that absolutely can't have that type of power, that kind of control, and we can't allow them to have it. Now, the anti-racist whites can have that because, go to the next slide, because I'm going to explain this. Because that will come from their playbook. Now you see, so when you look at the racism ruler, I designed this ruler. So let's start here at 10. These are basically, Klansmen. I mean, yeah, that's the best I can tell you. They're racist, they're proud of it, and they don't care what you think about it. There's gray areas as you move into indifference, right? Some folks will just say, listen, it is what it is. I'm living my best life. I got white skin privilege. I got white skin privilege, and I'm good with it, right? And as they slide, you go through that gray area, you get to the liberals, right? Who recognize the injustices in the system. They're very progressive, but they have not owned their racism. This is very critical that you understand. And they slide into the gray area. Now, the anti-racist, notice there's no zero on this scale, because no one's gonna, because of the socialization process doesn't allow for a zero, right? Because you're socialized to think a certain way, and it makes you human. It doesn't make you bad. This is what I want folks to understand. Doesn't make you bad. It makes you human, because we live in a society that socializes, like it socializes men to be sexist. All men harbor to some degree sexist sentiment. There's a sexism rule I have that I show in a different presentation, right? It doesn't make men bad. It's just down there. There's some on at a 10, and there's some who are working their way out of sexism, right? It's and Black people, harbor sentiments that can be construed as self-hating in nature based on the socialization, our socialization in American society. It is what it is. It doesn't make you bad. It makes us human. We've been brainwashed, basically. So in talking about interest conversion, my point is I do not want any of these folks, the liberals going right in different, and those who promote, to write the playbook if you're trying to cure racism or to deal with racism. I want the anti-racists, if we're going to allow whites to write the playbook, they have to write the playbook, because they're the ones who have owned their racism. These are folks like Bob Pellegrino, my dear friend, Tim Wise, Peggy McIntosh, the other Robin DiAngelo, folks like that who understand racism, who own it, who fight it. They're the individuals that I would count on to write that playbook to deal with racism. Next slide. Gina, go back to that last slide. And go back to one more, please. So when you talk about the interest conversion, and when they talk about doesn't trust any attempt to make racism better, just understand you can't do that. I'm not going to give that power, relinquish that power to just white people in general, because as Derek Bell says, short-lived victories that slide into irrelevance as racial patterns adapt in ways that maintain white dominance. And that's the goal. Let's skip the slides, G-Deck. Next slide. All right, no, go back. These are the last 4 myths about critical race theory. So believe science, reason, and evidence are a white way of knowing, and that storytelling and lived experience are a Black alternative, which hurts everyone, especially Black people. Rejects all potential alternatives like colored blindness as forms of racism, making itself the only allowable game in town, which is totalitarianism. That's ridiculous. But I want to come back to color blindness. Acts like anyone who disagrees with it must do so for racist and white supremacist reasons, even if those people are Black, which is also totalitarian. And that's BS, and cannot be satisfied. So it becomes a kind of activist black hole that threatens to destroy everything it is introduced into. More BS. But I just want you to be aware of the myths that are out there, because this is what they're using to enact the laws in the states that we previously discussed. Now, let me focus on this issue around colored blindness. Next slide. So, Salatan, he says, in the struggle to overcome bias, there is no obstacle more entrenched or effective than the conceit that you're exempt. That is one of the most powerful quotes I have ever read. In the struggle to overcome bias, there is no obstacle more entrenched or effective than the conceit that you're exempt. Now, the use of the term colored blindness is an attempt mainly on the part of members of the dominant culture to exempt oneself from being cast as one who harbors racial sentiments. It's a sham, a big lie. I said that. Now, let me explain. Color blindness, and we talked about it, the professor, Judge Robinson talked about You know, if everyone took a look around right now, just look around, you'll see color. There's no such thing as color blindness. It's a sham. It's a way of saying I'm not. Don't count me as being as one who harbors racial sentiment. I am exempt from that because I don't see color. And here's the thing about that. It's insulting when someone tells me that. Why do you have to deny my color in order to accept me? Why do you have to deny an essential aspect of my being in order to embrace me? My color doesn't define the totality of me or the totality of the individual, right? But a respect for differences is what we're talking about here. So when folks run around talking about color blindness, they're trying to exempt themselves. And in the struggle to overcome bias, there is no obstacle more entrenched or effective than the conceit that you're exempt. So they're insulting you when they say, oh, I don't see color. Of course you see color. We all see color. It's a sham, a big lie. Don't believe it. Next slide. So what drives the fear of CRT? So much of the fear regarding CRT is rooted in a psychological defense, a pushback to a changing America. This should be considered an irrational response. Additionally, when one reads between the distorted lines of the opponents of CRT, the following fears become clear to the cautious observer. Number one, accountability. Opponents of CRT don't want to discuss racial reconciliation. They don't want to discuss that. The truth that America has not been the land of opportunity for tens of millions of its Black citizens. And if that's so, then what's next? Reparations? Absolutely. And so no one wants to talk about the big R. But reparation has to be on the table. It has to be on the table. We cannot exclude it, right? But that's the fear. Because once you start talking about CRT, once you start talking about how American social institutions and laws are laced with racism that produce unequal outcomes, and you talk about all the hell that Black people have gone through in this country, once you get to that point, you gotta talk about reparations. And so that's a fear. Number two, CRT exposes millions of white children to the unpleasant truth about our nation. And this truth can very well lead to a restructuring, a reordering, or a reformation of the status quo in the not too distant future. Not that it changes the racial hierarchy, but it dismantles the present one. And that's a fear. The judge talked about that earlier. So whether it's white children, white adolescents, young adults, or adults, the issue is let's keep this truth away, because if not, we got to deal with the reformation of the American caste system, the order of things in American society. Next slide. So CRT confronts the mythology of America and its founding fathers, many of whom who owned slaves. Now, out of the first 12 presidents, 8 owned slaves. 17 out of the 55 delegates to the Constitutional Convention owned about 1,500 slaves, right? It exposes the hypocrisy of the Declaration of Independence and all those quote unquote pretty sounding words, as Malcolm X so eloquently spoke about. You're not that great. It exposes your mythology and all the nonsense that's been perpetuated over the years in the history books. So we don't want that truth to come out. CRT challenges the supporters of Make America Great Again to tell us exactly when America was great. When was it great? And that's a fear, because you can't, without putting your foot in your mouth. You can't tell us when it was great. CRT challenges the nation's dominant culture to answer, and this is powerful, folks. It challenges the nation's dominant culture to answer the fundamental question, has its racial psychology changed all that much? It's a powerful question. Are you the same as your ancestors? That psychology that made you come up with, I can sit on my behind and watch other people work for me, whip them to death, steal their children, rape their women, break the backs of their men. Has that psychology changed? Deny them education, deny them the right to vote, keep them in shackles, treat them like property, like a piece of furniture, like cattle? Has that psychology changed? It's a simple question, but a powerful one. And folks don't want to deal with that. They don't want to deal with America's ancient sin, which is slavery. Next slide. So here's the future of critical race theory. I'm almost done. Hope you guys are okay out there. The onslaught against CRT will intensify because it has now become the new boogeyman. It's no different than the assignment of negative connotations. The Professor Robinson talked about Marxism, and then they associate violence and communism and to previous movements like the civil rights movement. That's why they got rid of some of the leaders in the civil rights. When Bayard Rustin, who organized the March on Washington, was associated with the communist movement, and they got rid of him. Told King, you have to get rid of him. He has to go. Black Lives Matter, they call them Marxist inspired. This is what they do, right? They attach negative connotations to our movements to undermine the movement, to try to destroy the movement. This is what they do. And the condemnation is driven by an irrational fear. Number two, the battle over CRT will lead to further discourse and division along racial lines in the body politic, particularly at the state and local levels. And this will bring the country one step closer to civil war. Next slide. So what are we to do? Become sophisticated voters, and we can help you do that. Visit us at kiyamamovement.com and become a sophisticated voter. Know how to think, learn how to think, not just participate in politics, learn how to think, because the laws are being enacted at the state level. And some of us, become regular participants in the electoral process. I know I'm preaching to the choir because most of you do, but our job is to take it out there into the streets, into the community, particularly at the state and local levels. And number three, teach our children the truth about our sojourn in this country. Stop trying to make this thing palatable for white folks. Teach all of our children the truth. You don't have time to be worried about hurting people's feelings. Let's just talk the truth, and look, because no one is trying to have impolite dialogue, but we have to have real dialogue. And we have to talk about our many contributions to this nation and to the world. And that concludes my presentation. I thank you for indulging me.
All right. Thank you, Brother Attorney Jefferson, for that powerful presentation. And thank you to all of our panelists for sharing your thoughts this evening. So now is the time of the program that we will open up the floor for any questions. We'll do that through the chat room. So please, if you have any questions, comments, please drop them in the chat. And I know, so we have one. So this one's from Karen DuBois Walton. Every episode of Black progress in this country has been accompanied by a virulent white backlash. The reaction to CRT can be seen similarly. What can we learn from past examples of white backlash that can inform how we respond to this today? And that's it. Anyone can answer that.
That's a great question. That's actually what I ended on, because she's 100% right. I mean, that's the idea is to undermine our struggle. That's the idea, to maintain white dominance. We have to be real about that. That's what folks out there want to do. And I think the answer is to do exactly what we've been doing. Keep on moving. keep pushing, keep going forward, always forward, never stop. And just, we have to endure those attempts to block our paths. We have to endure, we have to overcome. It's just that simple.
Okay, thank you for that response. Thanks for that question. So I'll direct this question to Judge Robinson. So, and I know you all explained it, but just in your words, so 40 years, critical race theory, the concept has been around 40 years. Why are we just hearing about this now?
I think Professor Wharton did a great job of explaining why, and that's because it's really something that is applied in an academic setting at a more graduate school level. Some of the concepts are not things that are just easy to talk about in day-to-day conversation. That's what makes it so hard to push back against it, because it really has been something that's been used for very specific purposes by academics, and to a lesser degree by some social activists. So we're hearing about it now because a political party is weaponizing race, and that has been a part of our history in this country. And this political party is seen that weaponizing race and using critical race theory is winning for them. I agree with Attorney Jefferson, however, that this moment we just need to keep going. I think we've learned so much from the social justice and civil rights movements about how certain accommodations don't get us where we need to be. And so we are going to continue to move forward.
Thank you. Okay, and so so Professor Wharton, I'm trying to get this back up. How prepared do you think today's educators at the K-12 level are to present culturally relevant teaching, and what promising efforts do you know of that are preparing educators?
Well, as a matter of fact, I was on a panel discussion in Avon because they are trying to discuss critical race theory, and they're trying to find a way of not so much using the approach, but finding pathways to explaining different narratives and different histories in the classroom. So that was kind of an interesting discussion that I was a part of. I think part of the problem is I see this way too often in the college classroom at the undergraduate level, as I said at the beginning, where I'm not saying I reteach, but I have to offer these different lenses and different approaches to finally get there. And so many of the teachers admitted this in Avon. At the same time, to go with Attorney Jefferson's point, it's kind of interesting because many of these, same teachers and parents and administrators will admit that, well, they live in a very segregated town and they see it all around them, and they're seeing that, it's not what it should be. So I think it's interesting that you're seeing almost kind of an awakening, if you will, even in Connecticut and some of these places, and acknowledging that, look, it's not just in the classroom, and it's not just, in our school systems, it's actually around us. And so I think it has to begin right there. I think we have to have an acknowledgement, a reality check, and then really get into the histories and in these different lenses and perspectives to finally get into a lot of the classrooms and so many different pathways to get there.
Yeah, thank you for that response. And I do apologize, Judge Robinson. Thank you for your early response too. I was kind of multitasking, so I didn't mean to acknowledge that. And so in my role as diversity, the Director of Equity and Inclusion at ACES, I came across this past week, and it kind of put me in a different place, that we have educators who are just not prepared and just not comfortable talking about race. So I think that's kind of the next phase of this as we try to deal with this boogeyman. But let me and I'll go back to Brother Jefferson. The term critical race theory has been inaccurately portrayed as encompassing a wide range of distinctly different topics, including educational equity, social emotional learning, cultural responsiveness, and restorative practices. What are some of the other initiatives that have been mislabeled as critical race theory?
There's so many because the folks, let's just put it this way, Brother Wharton, folks don't care how it's mislabeled as long as it's mislabeled, because the whole idea is that they're trying to deflect and distract from what we're trying to do here with critical race theory, and it's been going on forever. So they could care less how it's labeled. And, you know, some teachers should not teach about race because they don't understand race. It's like asking them to teach physics. I mean, this is, you know, race and racism, that's a, you know, that's something that has to be learned. I mean, you just can't just jump in there with an opinion, just bring it out, you know, like, you know, who's the best basketball player of all time, who's the best football player of all time. And of course, you have an opinion about that. Race is different. I mean, that's a serious subject matter, you know, for folks to understand and to study. And whites, you know, in general, have to own their racism. And I say that from day one. And if you don't own your racism, don't say anything about race. You can't. You have to own your racism. And it's not, I'm not saying that makes you a bad person, but the dominant culture simply want to have their cake and want to eat it too. Many members of that culture, right? There's 8 to 10% who own their racism. So they could talk about race. They could talk about it because they've owned their own race. It's like men, you know, don't ask women to take up the burden of sexism, right? That's something men have to deal with. We perpetuate sexism. So we have to, number one, before we talk about it, we have to own it. We have to say, you know, I'm a sexist. I harbor sentiments, or better yet, make it more palatable. I harbor sentiments that could be construed as sexist in nature. I recognize that. This is how I deal with it. This is my understanding of it. This is what I want you to know about it, sir.
Okay. Yeah. Hey, listen, you know, as always, very powerful. And I think you spoke on it earlier during your presentation. And I think that's probably the first time I heard it really named, saying that, you know, that people need to own it. And the fear of losing status quo, the fear of restructuring the hierarchy. And I think that's always something that we have to keep in mind moving forward. So Judge Robinson, anti-CRT folks are protecting white students and white educators from feeling uncomfortable in class. Black students about time have felt uncomfortable in classes as students, and was anyone concerned about protecting them when learning whitewashed history of reading racist literature like Mark Twain's Huck Finn and what's the other so-called classic that we all had to read, To Kill a Mockingbird?
So that's a great question, and it's always sort of ironic to me when parents use that as the argument. When they use the argument that we don't want our children to feel uncomfortable. First of all, that's not critical race theory. That's just teaching race history. That's just teaching facts. And they do not seem to be as concerned about the children. And I know that Attorney Jefferson cited a number of the laws that are passed, but it's very interesting that they're so subjective. You know, they all go on the subjectivity of how white children feel. And I wonder, can we turn it around? Like Attorney Jefferson, I wanted to talk to you about this. Can we take that law and use it on behalf of children of color? Because some of them are so ambiguous and so amorphous that it's hard to know how they can be applied.
Thank you, Judge Robinson. Brother Jefferson, you want to respond?
Yeah, I'm trying to flesh that out for me. Give me an example, because I want to make sure I'm hearing you and I'm answering you intelligently on that question.
Some of the language that I have seen seems to say the object of the law is to protect people from feeling bad about their race. And they don't specifically say white people feeling bad about their race. They say people feeling bad about their race. Why can't that be used on behalf of people of color?
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. I think it can be. The thing about it is, for me, is I don't see the harm in, let's say it's true. So what? Let's say it is going to make people feel bad. So what? That's my position on it, right? Because it's the truth. I don't see how you hide that truth. And that's something that we all have to accept. To read some of that, it's painful, Judge Robinson. Reading The Color of Law was so painful to think about what could have been. right? You know, and I was talking to Gary Highsmith earlier today, dear friend of mine, about the GI Bill and what that did for Black soldiers returning from fighting against tyranny in Europe and coming back here and could not get a loan to purchase a home, and white GIs got all the benefits. And 30 years from that time, now they can send their kids to college based off the equity in their homes, and we couldn't do that. And when you read these things, it is so painful to read about how we have been treated or mistreated in this country. And so when we're talking about this, I could care less how somebody else feels about this. I just don't care, honestly. I'm just being brutally honest about that.
Yeah,
Well, if I could counter that, I stress this because I face this so often in class. And what I remind them is to examine history and let that be the vehicle and the guide to explain away some of these policies and problems. Certainly, The Color Law is a great book, and I bring out passages of it, but I also use Crabgrass Frontier, which is one of my favorite books by Kenneth Jackson, that speaks towards these residential mapping systems that take place. I know Karen DuBois Walton knows that book, among many of those people who are involved in housing discrimination instances. And so it's interesting. For many of my students, they see this, and it's an awakening. When they see these maps and they see how the federal government, the bank, have found practices and ways to do it, it becomes sudden. It's reality. And I think for many of them, they sense frustration. How come this was not taught earlier? Why am I getting this now in graduate school? And I should have been alert to this even as a freshman in college. Or, hey, it was even possible to get it maybe in an AP class. Wouldn't that be terrific even in high school? So I think it's a matter of how do you find a way of I don't want to say catching up or even exposing or expanding, but really recognizing that, hey, there's a lot more to know out there.
So, Ruel, what time are we scheduled to go to? Or Ross Lee?
7:30.
7:30. Okay, yeah. So we're actually 4 minutes out from that, and so what I would do is I would give each of our panelists the opportunity to share some few last thoughts with us. But I do want to say this to Brother Jefferson's point about that GI Bill, and not only was it that that our soldiers didn't get the GI Bill, but there were developments that were being built that the law said it was for whites only, right? So even if they did get part of the GI Bill, they had to go back to another part. And this is when we start talking about redlining and everyone who's in cahoots. So I think to Professor Wharton's point, like some of the stuff that I continue to find out as a middle-aged adult, and I'm feeling the same way, like where the heck was this when we were growing up? And so it's intentional. It continues to be intentional. And we need to continue to do our due diligence on that. So with that, in the order in which we presented, I will give you all the opportunity to say some final last words to our audience, starting with you, Judge Robinson.
I'm going to defer my time to my fellow panelists, but just say thank you for this really interesting conversation. And I hope we get to continue it and expand on it, because I'm like you, Mr. Walton. I didn't know a lot of these things until I started studying, and I think there's so much more to learn.
Absolutely, absolutely. Well, thank you for your presence and your presentation, and we greatly appreciate you. So, Professor Wharton.
Brother Walton, yeah, no, I certainly agree with Judge Robinson on this. It was terrific to get an exchange, and I'm glad you all brought out the truth. You need to go out, you need to learn this, you need to engage in this, right? It's one thing to be reading all these books, to be reading all these articles, quite another, though, to engage and partake in this. And that's what I would say. That's kind of the frustration sometimes being in academia, is that you just get stuck in a room reading this stuff, and it's great to read it, but you got to find a pathway of explaining it, developing it, and doing more with it. And I think that's something that can be very empowering, and something like this in terms of an actual discussion, like what's been done tonight, it should continue, no doubt about it. That is the point of an education. It is not just merely to read a book, it's to actually find a way of applying it.
Yeah, and I agree with you. And again, I reference my work, and I decided, and what Karen and I have been working on is just trying to build these ways in which we go out and have these conversations with people, because to Mike's point and everyone's point, that race is uncomfortable for people, and it is a delicate balance to go out and talk about it, but it has to be done. If we're going to indulge in this work, then we have to be able to take those courageous steps to go ahead, but make sure we're doing it skillfully and artfully. And so with that, last certainly not least, again, is we'll close out with Brother Jefferson.
Yeah, first I want to thank you, Kevin, and the brothers of EII. You've done an amazing job with this Uplift series, and it's just been wonderful being a part of this. The second panel discussion I've been involved in. I just want to thank you guys for inviting me and including me and making me a part of a wonderful experience. I want to thank my panelists, my fellow panelists. That you always learn a different perspective, and I admire Judge Robinson so much. He's like one of the few people who's not so afraid to not invite me to speak in her classes. Some people just run away, and she's just, and by the way, Judge, I do think you're an expert on critical race theory. I loved your presentation, and Professor Wharton, thank you for bringing your perspective and all that you said and all that you do in your role at Southern Connecticut State University. I just want the folks to know that, these are some serious times, and this is times for serious people. And we just don't have time to screw around. We just don't. Folks always ask me, Mike, why are you so serious? Because this is serious business. These folks are for real, for real. They're not playing around, and my understanding of history, I'm a student of World War II and World War I and just a student of history. And I know, what these folks are capable of, and we should all know what they're capable of. So I'm not a expert necessarily on critical race theory, but I'm an expert on being a Black man in America, and I'm an expert on knowing what these folks are about. And so let's stay the course and keep our eyes on the prize. Thank you.
Well, yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. Thank you all. Well, that brings us to the conclusion of our event. We, on behalf of the Social Action Committee, we just want to thank everyone who came out and stayed with us tonight. As we advertised, this was a powerful panelists, powerful testimony from people. And we, as we rang the alarm tonight, there was lots of things, work to be done. You imagine that 37 states have enacted laws that state that they don't want to teach the truth about American history. And, what's it stopping from being 50, right? And the only thing that's stopping us is us, right? So we need to get on this fight and continue to fight. I would want to just let people know that our next community Uplift community conversation will take place March 23rd. And the topic will be social emotional learning. So please be on the lookout for that. And hopefully everyone will come back, and please tell a friend and bring a friend. And we greatly appreciate everyone. Continue to fight, and we'll say good night. Thank you, everyone. This was great.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Right.